The Arizona Territory sun hadn't yet burned away the morning mist when 16-year-old Samuel McKinnon spotted the crimson drops in the dust. His father's rifle felt heavy in his calloused hands as he knelt beside the old oak where their property line began, studying the blood trail that led toward the forbidden Copper Valley. Pa always said never to hunt alone, Sam whispered to himself, but his father's voice had grown hoarse and weak over the past months. The consumption was eating away at Marcus McKinnon's strength, leaving their small homestead struggling to survive another harsh winter. The wounded deer's tracks were clear in the soft earth, a large buck, probably 8 points, dragging its right hind leg. Sam's heart raced as he followed the crimson breadcrumbs leading away from their family's meager land toward territory that belonged to the Harrington clan. The McKinnons and Harringtons had been feuding for 3 generations over water rights to Willow Creek. Old man Josiah Harrington controlled the upper stream, while Sam's grandfather had settled downstream. Years of drought had turned disagreements into bitter hatred, sealed with gunpowder and blood, but this deer could feed his family for weeks. His dying father needed the strength that fresh meat would provide. Sam checked his ammunition, 6 bullets left, and tightened his worn leather boots. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine from the mountains. "I ain't gonna let this one get away," Sam muttered, adjusting the faded blue bandana around his neck. The same bandana his mother had sewn before the fever took her 2 winters ago. As he followed the blood trail deeper into disputed territory, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just a wounded animal was leading him into the unknown. The drop seemed too perfectly spaced, too deliberate, but hunger drove him forward, past the last fence post that marked safe ground. The sun climbed higher, turning the red rocks around him into glowing embers. In the distance, Copper Valley stretched out like a scar across the landscape, a place where his father had warned him never to venture, though Marcus had never explained why. Sam paused at a small creek to fill his canteen, noticing how the water ran clearer here than back home. The deer tracks continued on the far bank, and something glinted in the mud beside them. A brass button, military issue, though no soldiers had been through these parts in months. "What were you running from, old buck?" Sam asked the empty air, but the wind only answered with a low moan through the canyon walls. The blood trail was getting fresher now. He was gaining on his quarry. The wounded deer led Sam higher into the rocky terrain, past twisted mesquite trees, and through narrow passes where the walls seemed to close in around him. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and the canteen felt lighter with each sip. But the blood trail remained strong, almost beckoning him forward. 3 hours into his pursuit, Sam reached a plateau overlooking Copper Valley. What he saw made him drop to his knees behind a boulder, his heart hammering against his ribs. Below, in a hidden section of the valley he'd never seen before, stood a collection of weathered buildings that shouldn't exist. Not a town exactly, but more than a simple camp. Wooden structures with tin roofs, corrals with horses, and smoke rising from at least 3 chimneys. But it was the men moving between the buildings that made Sam's blood run cold. They wore no uniforms, but they carried themselves like soldiers. And they were unloading crates from wagons, crates marked with government seals. "What in the hell?" Sam breathed, pressing himself closer to the rock. The wounded deer had disappeared, but Sam barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on a familiar figure emerging from the largest building, Josiah Harrington himself, the man his father had taught him to fear and hate. But Harrington wasn't alone. He was deep in conversation with a man in a fine black coat, someone who clearly didn't belong in this rough country. Sam fumbled for the small telescope his father had given him for his last birthday. Through the lens, he could make out more details that made his stomach churn. The government crates weren't supplies or ammunition. They were smaller, more carefully handled, and there were too many armed men for this to be any legitimate operation. "Stolen federal gold!" Sam realized with a whisper that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. They're stealing from the government shipments. He watched as Harrington directed his men to load some of the crates into a hidden cave entrance, while others were transferred to unmarked wagons. The man in the black coat handed Harrington a thick envelope. Payment, undoubtedly. Sam's mind raced. His family had been struggling while the Harringtons controlled their water rights, but this explained how they'd maintained such wealth during the drought years. They weren't just ranchers. They were thieves on a grand scale. A twig snapped behind him. Sam spun around to find himself staring down the barrel of a Winchester rifle held by a bearded man in dusty clothes. The man's eyes were cold as winter stones. "Well, well, looks like we got ourselves a little spy," the man drawled. "Boss ain't gonna like this one bit." Sam's rifle lay useless beside him, and his hand froze halfway to his sidearm. The man's finger was already on the trigger. "Please, mister, I was just hunting. That deer. Save it, boy. I know who you are. Marcus McKinnon's whelp. Been wondering when one of you would stumble onto our operation." The man's smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" In the valley below, a bell rang twice. Some kind of signal. The man with the rifle glanced down briefly, and in that split second, Sam made his choice. He lunged sideways, rolled behind another boulder, and scrambled toward a narrow crevice in the rocks. A gunshot echoed through the canyon, and rock chips exploded near Sam's head. He squeezed through the gap and found himself on a narrow ledge that wound around the cliff face. Behind him, he could hear shouting and the sound of boots on stone. Sam ran along the treacherous path, knowing that one wrong step would send him tumbling to his death. But behind him lay certain capture, and he'd seen enough to know that these men wouldn't hesitate to silence him permanently. The ledge led to another section of the valley, and Sam could see a way down through a series of natural stone steps. But as he looked back, he realized he wasn't just running from one man anymore. At least 3 figures were pursuing him, and they knew this terrain better than he did. Sam's only advantage was his desperation and the terrible knowledge of what he'd discovered. Sam half ran, half slid down the rocky slope, his boots sending loose stones clattering into the abyss below. Behind him, the voices of his pursuers grew closer, their curses echoing off the canyon walls. His lungs burned in the thin mountain air, but he couldn't stop. Not when he carried information that could hang half the Harrington clan. The narrow game trail wound through a maze of red sandstone formations, each turn offering both hope of escape and the terror of a dead end. Sam's shirt was torn from the thorns, and his hands were scraped raw from grabbing at rocks to steady himself. A rifle shot cracked through the air, and a bullet whined off the stone inches from his head. They were close enough to aim now. Sam dove behind a fallen boulder, his chest heaving. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see 2 men working their way down the slope, the bearded man who'd caught him, and another he recognized as Jake Harrington, Josiah's eldest son. Jake carried a repeating rifle and moved with the confident stride of someone who knew he had his prey trapped. "Nowhere to run now, McKinnon," Jake called out. "You're in our territory, boy. Been trespassing on Harrington land." Sam checked his rifle, still loaded, but 6 bullets against who knew how many men wasn't odds he liked. His father had taught him to shoot straight, but Marcus had also taught him when to fight and when to use his head. "I saw everything," Sam shouted back, his voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. "The gold, the wagons, all of it. You think killing me will keep that secret?" A moment of silence, then Jake's harsh laughter. "Who's gonna believe the word of a dying man's son against the Harrington name? Besides, accidents happen in these mountains all the time." Sam closed his eyes, thinking of his father wasting away in their cabin, depending on him to return with food and hope. Then he thought of the stolen federal gold, the kind of money that could have helped every struggling family in the territory. The Harringtons had been hoarding wealth while their neighbors starved. A new sound reached his ears, the rumble of approaching horses. Sam peered around the boulder and saw dust clouds rising from the valley floor. A cavalry patrol riding hard toward the hidden settlement. "Damn!" he heard Jake curse. "Someone tipped off the army." The bearded man's voice carried on the wind. "We got to get back. Warn your pa. This whole operation's blown." Sam realized this was his chance. While his pursuers were distracted by the approaching soldiers, he could slip away. But as he started to move, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Down in the valley, the man in the black coat was directing Harrington's men to hide the evidence, but they weren't just moving the gold. They were preparing to destroy the entire settlement, burning buildings and eliminating witnesses. Sam could see several people who looked like prisoners being herded toward the old mine shaft. Innocent folks were about to die to cover up the Harrington crimes. Sam McKinnon faced the hardest choice of his young life. He could save himself, slip away, while Jake and his men dealt with the cavalry. Return home to his dying father with empty hands but a whole skin. Or he could risk everything to save people he didn't even know. The sound of gunfire erupted from the valley as the cavalry engaged the Harrington gang. In the confusion, Sam saw his path down to the settlement. Dangerous, exposed, but possible. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A man ain't measured by what he takes, son, but by what he gives when it costs him dear." Sam McKinnon shouldered his rifle, said a prayer to his dead mother, and started running toward the sound of guns. Behind him, Jake Harrington realized his quarry was getting away. "The boy's heading for the soldiers," Jake shouted. "Stop him!" The race was on, with innocent lives hanging in the balance and a 16-year-old boy carrying the weight of justice on his shoulders. Sam reached the valley floor as bullets whistled overhead. The cavalry and Harrington's men locked in fierce combat around the hidden settlement. Smoke from burning buildings stung his eyes, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled his lungs. Through the chaos, he could see the prisoners, 3 men and a woman, being forced at gunpoint toward the mine entrance. A cavalry sergeant, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, spotted Sam emerging from the rocks. "Get down, boy. This ain't no place for civilians." "Sergeant!" Sam shouted over the gunfire. "There are prisoners! They're gonna kill the witnesses!" The sergeant's eyes sharpened. "Where?" Sam pointed toward the mine shaft, just as Josiah Harrington himself appeared, a pistol in each hand. The old man's face was twisted with rage as he barked orders to his surviving men. "Burn it all! Leave nothing standing! And get those people into the mine permanently!" The bearded man who'd been chasing Sam appeared beside Harrington, his rifle trained on the prisoners. "What about the boy? He saw everything!" Harrington's cold eyes found Sam across the smoky battlefield. For a moment, the two enemies, separated by 3 generations of hatred, stared at each other through the drifting smoke. "Kill him," Harrington said simply. But Sam was no longer the frightened boy who'd followed a deer trail that morning. The events of the day had burned away his childhood, leaving something harder in its place. He raised his father's rifle with steady hands. The sergeant saw Sam's determination and made a decision that would be talked about in army circles for years to come. "Corporal Davis, take 3 men and get those prisoners. Kid, can you shoot?" "Yes, sir." "Then cover our flank." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Sam McKinnon's life. He found himself fighting alongside professional soldiers, his rifle cracking in rhythm with theirs as they pushed toward the mine shaft. Jake Harrington and 2 of his men had taken cover behind an overturned wagon, their repeating rifles keeping the cavalry pinned down. Sam worked his way around the right side, using the burning buildings as cover. The heat was incredible, and twice he had to beat out sparks that caught on his clothes. But he reached a position where he could see the prisoners clearly. The woman was Sarah Chen, wife of the Chinese merchant who ran the general store in town. The men were federal agents who'd gone missing weeks ago while investigating the gold thefts. They were all going to die unless Sam acted. He had 2 bullets left. The bearded man stood guard over the prisoners, his back partially turned. Sam drew a bead on him, his father's lessons echoing in his mind. Breathe slow, squeeze gentle, follow through. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bearded man spun and fell, 1 bullet left. Jake Harrington wheeled around, seeking the source of the shot. He spotted Sam and brought his rifle up in a smooth, practiced motion. Sam knew he was outgunned and outclassed. Jake had been shooting since he could walk. But sometimes desperation trumps skill. Sam's final bullet took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. In the same moment, the cavalry sergeant and his men reached the prisoners, cutting their bonds and pulling them to safety. The battle was over. Josiah Harrington, seeing his operation in ruins and his son wounded, threw down his weapons. The stolen gold was recovered, enough to help dozens of struggling families through the coming winter. As the dust settled and the cavalry secured the area, Sam found himself sitting on a boulder, suddenly exhausted. The sergeant approached, his face grim but respectful. "Son, what you did today? That took more courage than most men show in a lifetime." Sam looked down at his father's rifle, then back at the burning settlement. "Just did what needed doing, sir. The government's going to want to reward you for this. There's money coming for the information that broke up this ring." For the first time that day, Sam smiled. "My pa's gonna need medicine, real medicine from back east." 3 months later, Marcus McKinnon sat on his porch, color returning to his cheeks thanks to the treatments that government reward money had bought. He watched his son splitting firewood with confident, measured strokes. "Still think about that day, don't you, son?" Sam paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Every day, Pa, but not the way you might think. How's that?" Sam looked out toward Copper Valley, where a new settlement was rising, a legitimate one built with honest work and federal support. "I keep thinking about that wounded deer. Never did find where it went." Marcus chuckled, a sound that had been absent from their home for too long. "Maybe it wasn't running from something, Sam. Maybe it was leading you to something." Sam McKinnon nodded, understanding something about destiny and choice that most men never learn. The lonely hunter's son had followed a blood trail and found more than just prey in that hidden valley. He'd found his purpose. And in the distance, if you knew where to look, you could still see the old mine shaft where justice had been served and innocence preserved. The valley had kept its secrets for generations, but sometimes the truth has a way of finding the surface, especially when carried by a 16-year-old boy with his father's rifle and his mother's courage.